we're going to welcome back Greg Iles, who is behind 2 or 3 people looking for seats. So please give Greg a nice round of applause. We both thank you for your patience because we are 9 months.
Yeah.
9 months late for this
No
movie.
wonder I read that book so long.
You know, I'm so glad you said that because neither Greg or I are sure we can remember cemetery well enough to talk about it. So, you know, we may need help from the audience to do that.
This may just be a general, wide-ranging.
Exactly. So, in any case, first of all, let me wish you all a very happy holiday season. And doesn't it seem remarkably short? There's only one more shopping week. I know. So, and I got an email today from one of the major wholesalers saying that the orders were so overwhelming, the entire shipping system is so stressed out that they're running 2 or 3 days late. So just to mention it to you, you're not necessarily going to get delivery when you think you are. So I'm glad you're here where you can actually pick things up. All right. So, Greg, how are things in Natchez, Mississippi?
They're okay.
They're okay?
Yeah, let me preface, if I have a coughing fit in the midst of this, I've had the flu for 8 days. If it was anybody except Barbara, I wouldn't have come out here, but I did. And you guys, I felt bad. I got a few angry letters even from loyal fans around here saying, I drove 40 miles and you weren't even there. So I had to make it, but I could erupt into an embarrassing gross fit, so I'll go over here and Barbara will cover the mic. She'll handle the conversation.
He said I could just bullshit for, however long it would take, because you all know how good I am.
She claimed great prowess at the art of bullshitting.
So I was thinking, it has been quite a while since I read, but I did a little review, and are you a Ross McDonald reader?
No, not a big one, just fairly familiar. I know.
But Ross McDonald really liked talking about fathers and sons. Most of his books revolved around that relationship. And Cemetery Road is certainly a book that is in Ross McDonald territory.
You just made me think of something I didn't talk about on tour. I'll tell you what was challenging for me about that book and what was different was that even though it was set in the South and a lot of the milieu was familiar to my readers and to me, most of my father-son relationships have dealt with the long-running relationship between Penn and Tom Cage, which is a loving relationship and an admiration relationship. And so for the first time in 17 books, I wrote a novel about a father and a son who were estranged, who didn't get along, who were separated by a profoundly tragic event. And that had not been my life, really. So I was writing about something that wasn't firsthand. Now, it was based somewhat on... We are recording this, right? I'm back in trouble territory. I knew people who had been through things like this, let's say. And, I guess all your life as a writer, you're working out different things you know about and people you're intimate with, and this was a case of that.
Well, but don't you think when you're writing dynastically, in your case it's the newspaper dynasty, that there are always dysfunctional parts of those families?
I think there are dysfunctional parts of all families. Yeah. That's the reason these books sell, right?
So how many of you have seen the movie Knives Out so far? Well, if you really want to see a dysfunctional family, a seriously dysfunctional family, you should go and see it. Daniel Craig has adopted I didn't think it worked, and you would probably really be appalled, a Mississippi accent.
Oh, God. Oh.
And at one point, the best line in the movie, somebody says to him when he's doing his detective thing, CSI? And the other person says, no, KFC. It is really a bad accent, but he did it on purpose. But anyway, he's representing Mississippi in some place up in but he's supposed to be an American Hercule Poirot.
Okay.
Yep. And so you have a big house and a family beyond dysfunctional. So
I already don't buy this. I'm gonna go see it tomorrow.
You'll love it. You'll really love it, right? And while the elderly gentleman in his 80s, this was resonant with me, and this happens at the very first part of the movie, so no spoiler, is the murder victim. His mother is still on the scene, and somebody says, well, how old is she? And they said, nobody knows. So I thought, someday I will be this mother, right? But anyway, the newspaper business, did you know, why was that of such interest to you? Because it's a central part of the book.
Couple of reasons. One, growing up in the era I did, I looked at guys like that as heroes, really. You know, the Woodward and Bernstein myth, sort of. Not myth, but the reality. And second, I have witnessed the slow hollowing out and erosion of that business, and it's a terrible thing for the country. I mean, and all people in small towns know that. You know, these papers served. I think I'm sort of like ham radio operators. You know, you never think about it when you're just reading the Little League score or what happened at the alderman meeting or whatever. But you know, when you have a nuclear war, suddenly the ham radio operators are the only thing that matters. You know, and when you have a crisis, small town journalism really matters, you know, and these people, I don't think it's going to be replaced. It's hollowed out. The jobs disappear. It gets, media becomes homogenized and politicized and made large scale, and we all consume the same thing. And I just hate to see it happen. So I wanted to chronicle it a little bit.
Okay. Let's see. What else can we talk about Sybil? Why did you call it Cemetery? I mean, it's an interesting title.
Cemetery Road, because Cemetery Road. One of the challenges and fun parts for me was that town, Greenville, Mississippi, in that book. I'm very proud of that as a writer because I constructed that town in a way that I wanted historians familiar with the South to read that and think, is that real? Is that maybe it's there and I don't know about it? Because I wanted to blend it so tightly into history and what had happened there. So that was fun, and it was a challenge. Now, Cemetery Road is of profound interest to me in the actual Natchez, and it plays a role in the trilogy and different things. But Cemetery Road to me, and in that town, was a metaphor for what we're all on all the time, which is the road to the cemetery, as simplistic as that sounds. When you're young, you never think about it. You may be 16 and getting drunk with your first 8-pack of beer and making out in the cemetery, but you're on Cemetery Road eventually for that final ride, you know? And so I think when Tom and, I'm not Tom and Penn, but when the characters in the book are, I think of them as Tom. When the
Who are they? Does anybody remember the name?
Yeah, when the characters are there and the father is really close to dying, he draws out that metaphor himself, just very deadpan. And, you know, I think we're all trying never to think of, most of American life is devoted to denying mortality, I think. You know, people do everything we do to try to not acknowledge it. Whereas if you go back 100 years, death was just a part of life in every American family. People died at home. People were born at home. People commonly buried people on the farm or whatever, you know, but it wasn't this great black thing that we pretend doesn't exist, you know?
So we have had 2 authors here in recent times, 2 or 3 months, who have written about interesting aspects of Mississippi. S.J. Roseanne wrote a really wonderful book called Paper Sun, which is about a Chinese community near, would I be right in saying Clarksville? Does that sound right?
Clarksdale.
Clarksdale.
Yeah.
Which was a whole thing about Mississippi. It never even occurred to me that there would be a large Chinese community.
I need to read that.
They were there for the railroad, right?
There are a lot of little communities in Mississippi like that. The Italian communities that were like that, Chinese, several insular things. And then in the more modern era, the Vietnamese community on the coast. But the Chinese one, I remember reading about that now. It's a very distinctive history. And in Mississippi, it's not the same thing, but reading the history of the Jewish community in Mississippi is really something. In the 19th century, it was a strong, strong presence there in Natchez and then later in the Delta. It's very interesting.
And what was it, a merchant thing?
Yes, it was mercantile class, really, and they very quickly developed a good bit of power, you know. They went from being itinerant to being, I mean, we have a wonderful synagogue in Natchez that is sadly closed now. It's kept open, but it was dedicated in, I think, 1840 something by, you know, whoever the top rabbi in New York and stuff. You know, I mean, it was an important part. And the sad thing is this: if you look at the Jewish community in Natchez, you see sort of the history of the state writ large, which is when I was growing up in the 70s, I knew the schools were filled with the kids of those people. And then they went off to Vanderbilt and other places and everything, and then they didn't return. They live in Nashville or Dallas or wherever. And so there was this brief flowering, and it made the community a better place. And then now there's almost no trace. You know, it's sad. And the fortunes of the state kind of move with that.
It's interesting. That is also true of New Mexico. There's a whole population in New Mexico called conversos, and they were Jews who fled the Inquisition and came up from Spain to Mexico and came up to New Mexico. And they retained some of the rituals and traditions, but they forgot why they were doing it, which is why, you know, and converso means they converted,
don't know they're
but
Jewish.
Didn't really. My husband is Jewish, and he comes from a very famous Jewish family who had a mercantile establishment in Albuquerque at one point. But he has an aunt who actually researched the whole thing, wrote a really good book about the conversos, which is why I know about it. Isn't it interesting how we get random knowledge from you know, things in our lives that you wouldn't? That's why you all come here, right? So I can diversify and you can learn all these things.
That's how writers make a living, is with those tidbits of knowledge.
So Patrick, when Ace was here, was it the Jewish community? Well, what was he talking about? Or you weren't here?
I wasn't here.
You weren't here. That's right. You were recovering.
Plead the fifth.
Yeah, that's too well. Anyway, Ace Atkins writes, you know, about a part of. I'm trying to remember where it is. What part of Mississippi does he write about?
Well, it's Tibaha County is what he calls it. I think it's based on I'm not exactly sure where in the state, but
it's a made-up thing. Like,
I think it is. Yeah, small
Ace
town.
is in Oxford, and I think his area is sort of northern Mississippi.
Right. So he has a sheriff that's, you know, working territory in Mississippi. But you have, you know, certainly the trilogy. You focus really on Natchez.
Well, it's really, when you hear Mississippi, you can't think of one place. You know, it's like saying Florida. People who know, Florida is like 3 different countries, minimum, okay? The Panhandle is so far from Miami, you can't even link the two, you know, culturally. Mississippi's sort of like that. You know, the Mississippi Delta, which is now just a hollowed out, dying place. Oh, God. I mean, the Mississippi Delta, we live in a time now where you can farm 1,000 acres of cotton with one person and a computerized GPS tractor. And unemployment is horrible, okay? So the Delta was you know, I mean, let's face it, some of the worst things that ever happened in the Delta. It's also the birth of the American art form, the blues, you know? It's the Coen brothers, oh brother, where art thou? You know, that's the Mississippi Delta. But now, there's just nothing there. It's a food desert. It's just an agribusiness from, you know, they used to say the Mississippi Delta stretched from Catfish Row in Vicksburg to the lobby of the Peabody Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. You know, it was sort of this romanticized version. But no, it's nothing like that now. And then, of course, in northeast Mississippi, sort of the hills and sort of hard scrabble. Oxford, you could look at as this little island of civility or perhaps liberality, although it's always been pretty conservative in its blood. But Natchez was always, because it flew under so many foreign flags, Spain, France, England, it was always a place where the bars never closed, and that puritanical, you know, hard Christian fundamentalist thing never took root. The people were very, very wealthy. As I say a lot, in 1850 there were more millionaires in Natchez than anywhere in the United States except New York and Philadelphia. So it was a unique place, very educated place for Mississippi, very liberal place. And so it makes it just a wonderful, rich tapestry and milieu, and no connection to the rest of Mississippi, really. In fact, when I went to American Legion Boys State, I was sent there as a delegate in the 11th grade, like, you know, Bill Clinton or whatever, that kind of thing. We got the feeling, me and another guy, the boys from Vicksburg hissed us and hated us and everything, and we're like, what? Like, because we're from Natchez. That's because while Vicksburg, never surrendered and ate rats and did all those things, people in Natchez surrendered early and often. Come on in. They were rich as hell, and they had land holdings all over the country and gold in London. It's like, we're not fighting over this. We're not getting our houses burned. It's a very different place.
Patriotism took a different form. So the river was, a huge highway. It was a huge commercial highway and stuff in the 19th. And now I was thinking about this. The cruise industry has made such a remarkable change, especially in the Mediterranean. If you go to Barcelona now, you have to have time tickets to go and see Park Güell or to go to La Sagrada or whatever. There are the Faroe Islands has decided to put a boycott in on cruise ships and all. I mean, they've just done such an enormous amount of damage bringing in all these huge groups of people. The Mississippi now has got a whole thing going of, Minneapolis, St. Paul, all the way down the river now with a couple of cruise lines, the American Cruise Line. Are they going to change Natchez? Because it's a hot stop on this whole river trip.
Two things I want to say about that. One, I did the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival with Dave Barry and some people, and I got hoodwinked into sort of agreeing to make an appearance for one of these cruises for zillionaires as they come down the Mississippi River, And I did it, and it was fun. I figured a cruise down the Mississippi would be pretty damn boring, to tell you the truth. I mean, God, how many miles of cotton fields can you look at? It's not like going down the Rhine where there's a castle popping up every second.
There are all those homes in Natchez you've already told us about.
Well, there are things to see. But I'll tell you what I've gotten back into the Mississippi River, and while I'm thinking of it, there's a wonderful new book by University Press in Mississippi, written by a woman named, Melody Golding. May have a fit coming on. Her family, she married into a family, one of the last privately held barge companies on the Mississippi River. And she wrote a book about the boat pilots of the Mississippi. It took about 10 years in the making. Initially, they didn't even want to talk to her. There's such a close fraternity of people. Not only men, but women. There are female pilots, too. And it's such a romantic thing. It's unbelievable. Do you know there's not an age limit for river pilots on the Mississippi? There's some 90-year-old river pilots out there. Do you know what one of the tests, until recently, one of the tests used to be a Mississippi River pilot, to sit down and hand draw 50 miles of the Mississippi River on a blank piece of paper. It's like Mark Twain come to life, man, I'm telling you. And I'm doing a new book that has to do with a bitter old river pilot who's angry at sort of the oil companies and people taking advantage of him. And it ends up dealing with sort of active environmental activism or terrorism, depending on your point of view, and the Mississippi River. But the river's hugely important to the country. 40 miles south of Natchez is the old river control station, which is one of the primary means of diverting water during the flood. It almost gouged out in '73. It almost scoured out. If that were to fail, and it's really a matter of time, not if, you'd see 60% of the U.S. petrochemical production wiped out in a week. It would change the face of the United States permanently. And we just Clive Cussler did a book sort of related to it years ago. Clive gave it the Clive treatment, which is fine. But it's a real thing, and it's I don't know, you may not be interested in it, but to me it's really, it's that's the kind of thing I get obsessed with, and I got to do a book.
What's the name of that book?
The name of her book, I don't know. Pilots is in the title, but her name is Melody Golding. It's an expensive book because it's a large book with large format pictures, and it's all in the words of the pilots. She's not writing about them. But when you want to read about some tough women, you read about some women who grew up on the Mississippi River working side by side with men. Anyway.
I always think about Mark Twain. I love that, marking on the twine. It's just such a wonderful, did they actually call out, do you know, when when we talk about marking on the twine?
Oh, yeah,
right.
yeah,
so
yeah,
they would
sure.
actually call the depths as they had the ropes.
Oh, yeah.
How fabulous. Actually, I have thought, this won't have anything to do with you, but I think the upper Mississippi, because they start this thing, above the way above the Twin Cities and come down. would really be an interesting, because I grew up in Chicago and we used to go over to the Mississippi, you know, it was around Iowa, my dad was from Iowa, and that part of the river, you don't think so much about, you know, it's not as romantic as is the lower part. Yes?
Yeah, it's called Life Between the Levees, America's Riverboat.
That's it, Life Between the Levees, yeah.
Isn't it great we all have phones? Whenever I'm at a loss, I just look at you and somebody always gets out their phone and saves the day, right? It's wonderful. But I do think, you know, that inevitably that some of the towns along the river, if there does become a lot of tourist traffic, are going to change again. You know, whether it's St. Louis or Memphis or Natchez or whatever.
Well, we need help in Mississippi, and I hope that can work. And I mean, Natchez is a bit of a special case because it's sort of a jewel architecturally, but the formerly thriving cities of like, well, that's what I addressed a little bit in Cemetery Road, was that cities like Greenville, which were just back in the day, those were sort of the you know, the capitals of those Delta fortunes, and I mean, those were fortunes. Those guys were on the phone with French bankers every day, and you know, this is back in the era of the 1927 flood and all that kind of stuff. That was big time finance. Those cities now are, oh man, they're just shells of themselves. I think Melody, the author of that book, told me, her husband told me that at one point, less than 25 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, there were 80 independent barge companies in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Now there are 3. So that's how fast things change in this country.
I wouldn't be terribly surprised if often read about the next, you know, the next wars are all going to be over water. And there's such an inequitable distribution of water that somebody, you know, eventually water may be piped in our direction, which of course leads to a whole nother level of security issues and so forth. But if you think about it, there's too much water and then not enough water, and at some point engineering is probably going to deal with that.
That's about the, you know what, when you live where I do and you take a lot of criticism and everything, there's one time you can be glad you live in Mississippi 300 foot over the river with all the water you'd ever need, because that eventually people are going to be moving there to get that.
They're going to be moving from Florida where they're underwater.
Unless they're in the Everglades where it's sunk and been dry.
So you've written an amazing number of books, all of which I have read over the years. Are you still focusing on Mississippi going forward, or do you ever have an idea about, you know, doing something different?
Let's why don't we ease off the recording as we go into this
all right.
thing.
This will be a wonderful moment then to say farewell.
Sorry you guys missed the good stuff.
Thank you all for joining us.
Nudie scenes are coming on.